Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Ted Hewitt, President of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, or SHRC, as we call it. I'd like to acknowledge that SHRC's offices are situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. As we are meeting in a virtual environment and from various locations, we also acknowledge from coast to coast to coast the ancestral and traditional territory of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who call this land home. I'm very pleased on behalf of SHRC to present this next event in our public talk series, In Conversation With, which we offer in partnership with the Conversation Canada. Le SSHRC est l'organisme fédéral de financement de la recherche au Canada.
Are Canada's federal research funding agency supporting research training and research in the social sciences and humanities. The researchers and students it supports advance our understanding of the human condition, human thought and behavior, cultures, and the workings of society. The work of scholars in the social sciences and humanities disciplines has never been more critical to addressing the challenges and opportunities facing society, from post-pandemic recovery to climate change and the environment to reconciliation with Aboriginal people.
We are delighted to partner with the Conversation Canada to bring the perspectives of some of Canada's best and brightest scholars to the public. These talks provide a unique forum where we can hear directly from academics who have important views based on scientific research to share. Their research can enrich our understanding of people and world affairs. Today, our distinguished guests are Drs. Jordan Stanger-Ross and Audrey Kobayashi. Dr. Stanger-Ross, a professor in the Department of History at the University of Victoria. His research focuses on migration, race, and inequality in the 20th century, especially in North America. He's joined by Dr. Audrey Kobayashi, professor emerita in the Department of Geography and Planning at Queen's University. Dr. Kobayashi's research centers on geopolitics, race, class, and gender studies. Monsieur Stanger-Ross a reçu le prix Connexion 2022.
Mr. Stanger-Ross received the Connection 2022 prize for his project called Landscapes of Injustice, an innovative interdisciplinary collaboration funded by the SSHRC. It is a groundbreaking analysis of the seizure and sale of Japanese Canadian homes, businesses, and assets. This project provides a unique historical perspective on the internment camp period in Canada. Mrs. Kobayashi has contributed significantly to the project as a collaborator and member of the steering committee. In addition to the SSHRC Connection Award, the Landscapes of Injustice project has also received numerous awards, including a BC Heritage Award for outstanding contribution to provincial history, a Canadian Race Relations Foundation Award for excellence in anti-racist education, and a Canadian Historical Association Award for excellence in public history.
Dr. Stanger-Ross and Kobayashi are currently co-directors of a new community-engaged SHRC partnership grant project, Past Wrong, Future Choices. The 7-year research collaboration will look at the internment, incarceration, and dispossession of people of Japanese descent in Australia, Brazil, Canada, and the United States in the 1940s. Today, our guests are joined by Vinita Srivastava from the Conversation Canada. Ms. Srivastava is host and producer of the podcast Don't Call Me Resilient, produced by the Conversation and partly funded by SHRC. She's also the Conversation Canada's senior culture and society editor. So thank you once again to everyone for joining the conversation. Je vous remercie encore une fois d'être.
I thank you once again for joining the conversation.
And Dr. Stanger-Ross and Kobayashi.
Thank you so much, Ted. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Vinita Srivastava. As you mentioned, I'm an editor at the Conversation Canada, and I'm also the host and a producer of the podcast called Don't Call Me Resilient. I thank everyone for allowing me to lead this discussion. I am going to not delay the conversation at all and start directly with my guests today. And Dr. Stanger-Ross, Jordan, I'm going to start with you. And I would like to start with the culmination of your 7-year project. For those listening here today who are present today who may not be familiar with your project, Landscapes of Injustice, can you briefly explain what it is?
Sure. Thank you, Vanita, and to the conversation and Shirk for this really exciting forum for discussion. And glad to be joined by Audrey, who will probably jump in at various moments in answering questions and vice versa. So maybe first, just to reiterate what Landscapes of Injustice was about. So one thing is, what was it about? And then we could say, what was it? So what was it about? It was a project focused on the dispossession of the property of Japanese Canadians in the 1940s. And by property, we didn't mean just real estate, although we did focus also on real estate, but all forms of personal property also, of which Japanese Canadians living in coastal BC in 1942 were dispossessed. And that policy, especially as Audrey and I, not to distract from Landscapes of Injustice, but as we move into international work also, it's confirming for us the ways in which that policy in Canada was unique to Canada. The scale at which the Canadian government seized and then forced the sale of the property, personal belongings, homes, farms, think clothing, furniture, musical instruments, businesses and homes, indeed, of especially citizens of the country, and force their sale against the consent of owners. That was a unique aspect of the Canadian policy within an international context, and was a particular harm that Japanese Canadians suffered, and a policy in its own right. And so our project, which was a big partnership project, and that's, when we get into the what, we can talk about that. But our project was focused on asking this question: how might we see the mistreatment of Japanese Canadians in the 1940s differently? How might we see the misdeeds of the government and of other actors outside of government differently if we focused on this permanent destruction of the homes, of the belonging of Japanese Canadians in the places where they had built home over several generations? How might we see that era differently? What if we think of it less as a temporary internment and rather focus on the permanent destruction of home and belonging? And so that was that. And so people who were interested in that, concerned about that, wanted to communicate that history, came together in a network of relationships that was Landscapes of Injustice.
You're partly talking about the way that the history informs even the current day today. Sorry, Audrey, go ahead.
Yeah, we might just add that dispossession also means dispossession of human and civil rights, the rights of people as Canadian citizens, the right to community, the right to free association, and all that goes with those legal as well as societal rights.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, you talked about this permanent destruction. Can you talk a little bit about how Landscapes of Injustice is different from other studies of this time period?
Sure. Yeah, as I and we have to get to we still have to get to the what at some point as well, right? Because I want to talk about all the other people, right? This award was granted to not to me individually, but as a representative of a team of which Audrey was a crucial part. But we had over a dozen partner organizations and as many as 70 people at different moments coming together to work on the project. So somehow we have to convey that.
So let's talk about the what just for a minute. Let's back up and explain what the what is, because this is a huge multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary project involving a lot of people, but also involving community. And so maybe you can explain what. I mean, I know there's the traditional output where you guys have you've published a book and you've done the traditional peer-reviewed scholarly journal articles that you've published. Well, what else is Landscapes of Injustice?
Sure, yeah. So I think the project really began as, so Landscapes of Injustice begins, I think, about now 12 years ago, I guess, 13 years ago, when I walked into the Nikkei National Museum as a solo researcher interested in an individual Japanese Canadians Japanese Canadian whose records were there at the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby, which is a wonderful heritage organization and museum of Japanese Canadian history. And they had materials related to this individual Japanese Canadian, a man by the name of Kishizo Kimura, who had participated in the forced sale of property of the Japanese Canadian community. So I was curious about him. And when I got there, I met the archivist there, Linda Kuwamoto Reed, who quickly started bringing me stuff that I hadn't asked for and conveying both kind of, I think, a community interest in this topic, but also an institutional engagement with this topic. And Linda suggested, well, if you're doing work on the dispossession, this is really a topic we need to know more about. That she conveyed to me a sense that I've then encountered often since, that within the Japanese Canadian community, there was a certain understanding built up around internment, of the nature of the harms there, uprooting and internment, the nature of the harms there, the government policy around it, the sort of terms with the ways in which we might debate that topic and the positions that exist within the community. But the dispossession of property in particular, and then as Audrey said, that concept expanded outward as we worked with it. But the dispossession of property was still much less known. People knew what they had lost. Individual families knew they had lost, yeah, both concrete property and, say, years of education and a community that had existed in Steveston or in Mission or Maple Ridge, right? But they didn't know the larger framework of the policy. Why had the government dispossessed Japanese Canadians after they were already uprooted and there were renters of their homes, for example, or their property was stored? How did that become a decision that the government took? Who got the property? And what did they do with that property after they got it? What kind of profits were generated through the dispossession? And where did this fit into the larger story? So Linda says you got to meet the director curator of the museum, who at that time was Beth Carter, and now Sherry Kajuara is in that same role, with whom I'm still working. And so I met Beth, and I knew that these partnership grants existed, whereby SSHRC invited researchers like me to work with and be able to give materially back to support the staffing demands that a big project makes on an institution like that. So I knew a little bit about this program. I said, well, I know there is this program, and we started to talk, and then I met Audrey around the same time. And so I met a bunch of researchers, and other institutions became involved. And then what Landscapes of Injustice was this container for, or a network of relationships of people who were interested in working together on these topics.
Mm-hmm. So let's just list some of the what's for a minute. So that's something like it's academic papers, it's a book, it's a website, it's a museum exhibit, it's collaboration, it's oral history, it's all of these things. Landscapes of Injustice encompasses so many different aspects over 7 years. Audrey, I want to turn to you for a minute, because one of the things that we've talked about is that in 1988, I know that this is one of the things that you have worked on as well, is that the Canadian government offered, well, not an apology, but a redress settlement, and for the internment of Japanese Canadians. And given that this is kind of, it's an acknowledged history in a way, can you explain a little bit, can you go a little bit deeper and explain a little bit more about why you spent 7 years exploring these stories of dispossession?
Yes, in 1988, we received a redress settlement that was the culmination of more than, well, of all of the time since the 1940s, but of 10 years of preparation and negotiation with the government. a few years before, then Prime Minister Trudeau had gone to Japan and apologized and said that the experience was a black mark. He said the experience of the Japanese, and we were appalled.
He went to Japan and he didn't.
Yes, he went to Japan and he said the experience of the Japanese in Canada. We were absolutely appalled because what he was talking about was the experience of Canadians who had known racism from the time that our ancestors began to come from Japan in the 1880s. And that racism continued not only against Japanese Canadians, but against Indigenous peoples, other Asian Canadian groups, all people of color. So partly we were motivated by the understanding that our experience fit in with the experience of a lot of other people of color in Canada. And we worked very hard, and I'm just going to mention two important principles. The first was that it was negotiated. The government didn't just up and decide that they were going to say they're sorry, which we didn't accept. We negotiated hard, not only over the financial terms, which were important for individuals especially, but also over the terms that would be lasting. Those who had been charged, for example, with violating curfew in their own country had all charges removed. Those who had been exiled, kicked out of their own country in 1946, over 4,000 Canadian citizens received their citizenship back and were told they're just welcome to return anytime they want. There were certain legal changes. The Canadian Race Relations Foundation was negotiated as one of the results of the settlement. And we worked really hard to make that negotiation acceptable based on the years that we had spent collaborating with community to find out what people in the community wanted. And so it was a community to government negotiation, not something that took place just from the government or from this small group of negotiators. And that to me is very important because it reinforced the notion of citizenship. When Mr. Mulroney by that time actually stood up and announced this redress settlement in Parliament, he had the support of every party. He had the support of many, many Canadians who had experienced similar things. And we left that negotiation with a hope that it would actually make a difference in terms of racism in our country, in terms of Canadians' understanding of Canadian citizenship and human rights.
You're talking about the way that history really informs our present and how what Canadians can learn about our present by looking at the past. Jordan, you've said that the study of history is never finished. Can you explain a little bit more about that? Why is it never finished? As a student of history, as a professor, why do you think that we must continue to study?
Yeah, I've been experimenting with different ways of conveying this, and I guess one thing I've been gravitating toward lately is the question, when do we get to stop brushing our teeth, right? Like I brushed my teeth earlier today, and many days in the past I've brushed my teeth. Why should I have to continue brushing my teeth in the future, right? There are some practices we need to maintain over time in order to maintain our health and good relations with one another, right? So I think history, the engagement with our own past is one of those. I take from scholars who lived through the Holocaust and other forms of extreme state violence, the lesson that those societies we least like to live in are those that have abandoned critical engagement with their own history, partly because history just can't be left in the past. Each of us has an understanding of how we fit into a longer story, and so too will institutions and political parties and aspiring political leaders tell us stories about our own history. And so I think, you know, if we abandon a critical engagement with our own past, we wouldn't leave the past out of our current social or political life. We would just leave those critical voices out of our social and political life. And I know we're going to come to this later in our discussion, but I see this foreign agent registry proposal around which the government is currently consulting Canadians, the federal government. I see this as a really clear example of an instance where careful study of what went wrong in the past and how, as Canada began to seek out and punish and develop unjust engagements with international conflict by executing policies towards Canadians living here in Canada. So and by that I don't mean a vague sense. I don't mean that we should have some vague sense that something was wrong there, but rather detailed, careful, scholarly study and ongoing public engagement around those questions, I think, is really crucial in a moment like this. And we wouldn't want, I don't think, to live through the next 10 years of Canadian history without ongoing critical engagement of our past.
I think that's really important. I think, Audrey, also, when we were talking before, you said, you know, we can't really understand what it is that we don't want to repeat unless we understand what happened in the past. So the past context becomes so important for our present. Audrey, what do you think that Canadians can learn today about the study of history? And what were you, in some ways, is this part of what you were hoping to accomplish with this idea of the past as a continuum?
Yes, we have a lot of specific things that we already knew or that we uncovered, and Jordan has been talking about quite a lot of those things. But for me, it's also the fact that if one Canadian experiences racism, then it's a problem for all Canadians. That's especially true when it comes to Indigenous peoples in Canada today who are fighting so hard for recognition and reconciliation. It's true for all groups of color who continue to experience racism, both of the minor, micro, everyday kind and of larger institutional and legal kinds. So let me just give one example. During COVID, one of the first things that happened with no relationship whatsoever to the question of health was that anyone who looked Asian, and we could debate what it means to look Asian, became susceptible to violence in our society. There were many, many cases either of actual violence, elderly women being pushed over on the street or hit in an elevator, and the psychic violence that is involved with taunting and screaming on the streets, being told to go back where we came from, to which I would reply, "You mean Kingston?" And that was a very reminiscent of the kinds of things that had never stopped. Okay, if racism against Asian-looking people of Asian heritage, as well as all people of color, had stopped, then this increase and visibility would not have occurred. But it was still reminiscent of what happened in the 1940s. Again, not just to Japanese Canadians, but to anyone on the street who happened to look Asian. And so a lot of people in Canada became aware of what was going on. And I was involved in a number of educational projects to try to address it and to say, if racism is always with us, then it's at times when people most display their ignorance or their fear, that it comes to the fore.
I might just jump in there. Thanks, Audrey, for those remarks. But to connect also to the research, I've emphasized policy. One of the things I think that distinguished our research, and really was through the efforts of an extraordinary master's level researcher who's now a PhD student in the States, named Caitlin Finley, who was also our research coordinator. So her job, we did 4 years of research and then about 4 years of knowledge mobilization activities and kind of SHRC language, but that was taking scholarly research and enabling teachers who had been involved in our project from the start and asking questions from the start to develop teaching resources for elementary and secondary school students, to work with curators to support the translation of that scholarly work into museum exhibitions, to create websites and to build an archival site. So Caitlin was at the center of that kind of work of translation. And we used to give what we say we're about to give a bad presentation. And then we talk for about 2 hours about the research findings to each of these heads of these different areas. And talking for 2 hours is, I think, automatically a bad presentation. But anyway, but it was a great process. And Caitlin, in the course of her research, I think was really the first person to reveal the extent to which looting and theft, it had been observed before, but the pervasiveness of looting and theft by everyday people in British Columbia, sometimes in the moments in which Japanese Canadians were leaving, some as they were forced from coastal BC, if they had a family member who was sick, for example. Some families stayed back while most of the community had been uprooted already, and observed trucks pulling up, neighbors bashing down doors, smashing windows, ransacking houses, destroying what they couldn't take and taking what they could. And that policy, that mass criminality had an impact also on the government policy itself. As part of what the government was dealing with was how to manage its responsibility at the time to care and preserve for the property of Japanese Canadians in the context of this widespread racist looting on the part of former neighbors of Japanese Canadians. And so
I like how you explain that in your study, that it's like a web. It's not just this policy, but it's a web, all these people underneath this policy that make this happen. So you've got the Canadian government official policy, but then you have the real estate agents and the neighbors, and everybody is complicit in this.
Yeah, and so and then you know, when we link that to today, I think we want that linkage, right, where we don't just say, oh, the government in Ottawa did a bad thing in the 1940s.
Right.
No, there was widespread complicity, and what's going on today? You know, how is it that policy will be shaped? Political parties may be shaped by the kinds of everyday expressions of racism that Audrey's talking about.
You
I just
meant,
want to
sorry, go ahead, Audrey.
that-
Go ahead.
Jordan used the term ordinary Canadians engaged in this looting. And that's very, very telling. These were not necessarily people who were simply criminals, but people who could distance themselves from Japanese Canadians sufficiently that they dehumanized them, so that anything goes. Their property was up for grabs because these weren't human beings in the same way that they were. And it's that dehumanization that lies at the heart of all racisms, and that lies at the heart of violence. We have to dehumanize others in order to create violence against them. And I think of the racist shootings that are going on in the United States. I think of all of the racist violence, sectarian violence that's going on throughout the world. And all of those involve this setting at a distance of people, the dehumanizing to make them so different that they can be subject to dispossession and violence.
I think the work that you do is so important also, because when I see you're mentioning the US, and I think this idea of people trying to retell history and how important it is to be continuously telling history. And and the ongoing stories that, as Jordan says, it's like brushing your teeth. You must do it every day. It's a really important work. Jordan, you mentioned the federally proposed, or this study that's ongoing right now about a foreign agent registry. You've recently written an article for The Conversation about this, and I feel like you're drawing a direct line between proposals like this foreign agent registry and some of the history that you're looking at. Can you explain a little bit about that line?
Yeah, I was really alarmed when I started seeing op-eds in support of the foreign agent registry and the kinds of defense that, or the kind of apology being offered for them. That just very, very reminiscent to me of my study of the 1940s. And I guess it feels that we're at the beginning of something here with the possible registration of people presumed to have some kind of foreign, or I think, I think enemy might be a way to put it, enemy interest. And that's how the process with Japanese Canadians began as well, with a registry, with a registration of people and of listing of people who were presumed to be advocating enemy interests, or what would soon be enemy interests once Canada actually was at war with Japan. And my sense is if this foreign agent registry and other proposals like it are being developed because we presume that we will find ourselves, Canada will find itself in an ongoing way in some kind of conflict with China, say, and some other international, bad actors from the perspective of the Canadian government, I guess. Then if that's true, and this registration is sort of then the beginning, perhaps, of many policies that might be directed at this geopolitical conflict, then to see that the registration of Canadians presumed to have some enemy interest or some foreign interest. The reason I say enemy interest is because I don't think anyone in government actually presumes that every point of contact between everyone in Canada and any what's defined in the kind of proposal language as foreign principles, so governments or organizations or people who are associated with foreign governments, I don't think it's ever imagined that every single point of contact between Canadians and anyone outside of Canada that could be described as a foreign principle will actually be registered. What it's about is concern about malign influence in Canada. It's concern about enemy influence in Canada. And so to move to a registration of Canadians, rather than some kinds of policies directed at China, just seems so reminiscent to me of policies that were directed at Japanese Canadians. And it's sort of striking. I went to the census site to look at this. It's almost the exact percentage of Chinese Canadians today. I think about 76% of Chinese Canadians today are Canadian citizens. And in 1942, 75% of people of Japanese descent living in Canada were Canadian citizens. So to begin a set of policies that would now begin with the registration of many Canadians as a way of dealing with our international conflicts is very alarming to me. And what I tried to argue in that piece is that there's a way in which these policies then generate their own challenges. So, for instance, just the sheer breadth of the language in that public consultation material. It would create, as I say, to register every connection with a foreign principle would create an administrative task of unfathomable scale. So of course that a proposal for a registry like that will then require further administrative solutions to problems that were generated by the first act, the first policy. And that's what we see with the cascade of injustice that affected Japanese Canadians, it was partly the racism of certain key politicians, as I've said, the opportunism of many in British Columbia to steal from Japanese Canadians.
Yeah.
But it was also folks in government undertaking the daily work of their jobs, solving what they saw as problems that presented themselves to them, administrative problems. And through the solving of those administrative problems of policies directed unjustly at Japanese Canadians, they compounded and generated further harms that affected Japanese Canadians. And I worry greatly that if we begin with with a broad registration of this kind directed significantly at Canadians, we're on another similar pathway of administrative solutions to the problems generated by misdirected policies.
Mm.
The key here is the notion of enemy or alien.
Right.
And we know from experience that Chinese Canadians will be painted with this brush of the alien,
Mm.
and it's already happening. They're treated as different, as not having the same kind of Canadianness that other people have. And I think there have been many examples when the Ebola crisis was at its height. African Canadians were shunned in the streets because they were seen as carriers, and the same has occurred in a number of different health crises over the years, where suddenly it's skin color or shape of eyes that determine the sense of who's Canadian and who isn't. And that's why these kinds of registries have to be looked at very, very carefully, not only in terms of whether they're effective or whether they're good policy, and certainly those questions have to be asked, but also the impact that they will have upon a public that carries either implicit or explicit understandings of who's Canadian.
I mean, I'm just thinking what you said about COVID, Audrey. It's just that in the last few years, the violence, the increase in violence against Asians in Canada just went up exponentially.
Yes.
Some stats say 50%. The reports went up by 50%. Informally, some people say 900%. That it was just like exponential violence.
Yeah, I think 900 is more accurate.
If I can move on just a little bit to your process, and we're almost out of time, and I want to talk a little bit about your process. And you've both talked a little bit about some of the creative chaos and the interdisciplinary partnership work that you did, and involving community and community researchers and community folks. Can you speak a little bit about the community process? I find it so wonderful and so fascinating. Maybe you could start with you, Jordan, and then maybe Audrey can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, certainly unlike any work that I did as a solo researcher, which was mostly my prior career to this project, or my career prior to this project. So a lot of the work is done in these rooms with, say, 70 people in them, including folks like Audrey, who've negotiated redress and done decades of work in the area, including folks who lived through and remember their own families, uprooting, internment, and dispossession, including students who just took it because it looked like an exciting job and know almost nothing about the topic whatsoever. And then you have different forms of expertise in the room. And we're dealing with a really difficult topic. Part of what there's the Undersecretary Undersecretary of State Ephraim Coleman, I think Undersecretary of External Affairs. He's a guy with glasses, this white guy with glasses, bald guy, who I often was putting up on the screen in the room, right? Talking about Ephraim Coleman. And there's I kind of see a kind of resonance between his image and me standing at the front of the room, right? So this is a complex topic in a complex room with folks of different backgrounds, experience, and expectations. And the history of activism and scholarship and the intermingling of activism and scholarship within the Japanese Canadian community meant that there were lots of folks with a lot of experience in different but somewhat related ways of engaging and concern about public communication of this history. So it was a challenging room. The work, this was hard work. And it was really exciting work, and it was very, very different for being conducted in those rooms. And I think what was crucial to it was a shared sense of purpose, ultimately, and a shared sense of curiosity. And the curiosity for me was a really exciting part of it, that each of us was asking questions to which none of us knew all of the answers. And I think of the chair of our community council, Vivian Wakabayashi-Ringnestad, who found out in reading one of our drafts of a paper that her father was a litigant in a legal challenge in the 1940s, challenging the dispossession of the community. And her father had never spoken to her about about his involvement in that case or that history. And boy, was our paper changed by sharing it with Vivian and writing it in the context and presenting it in the context of a room where we might be talking to the daughter of one of the litigants. That's a different kind of scholarly work than sitting in your office and banging out another publication or something. Very different kind of work. And for me, very powerful. And I don't think I could ever go back to the sitting in the office alone version.
This is participatory action research, or PAR, as it's known by scholars, and it has not always been acceptable. I have been doing participatory community research for my entire career, and when I started out, it wasn't recognized by organizations such as the SSHRC. Now it is, and it's partly because there have been so many scholars who have come to working with communities, and in some cases have come from communities themselves. And to me, what's really important is that this participatory work transforms communities, not from us as scholars, but communities transform themselves as they participate together. And, the scholars don't have any particular privilege other than fundraising and kind of instigating things. They often say, no, that's not okay. That's not how you do it. And that sense of everyone transforming themselves is just an amazing rush.
So you're saying sometimes community members jump in and tell you, actually, no,
yeah.
we want to do things this way, not this way.
Absolutely.
That's amazing. I want to leave time for some questions and answers. So in my very last question, I'm just going to ask you both to tell us briefly about your new partnership, past wrongs and future choices.
Yeah, thanks. Really excited to be at the beginning of this new partnership. It emerged from discussions in landscapes of injustice as we came to the end of that project, but also involves partners all over the world. It's a much larger partnership, in fact, with partners in Brazil and Australia and the United States and Japan and across Canada. We're really excited that we were joined by all of the institutional partners on landscapes of injustice. All the institutional partners with mandates in the Japanese Canadian community joined us again, and we remain rooted in that Canadian base. And today we've talked a lot about Canada, right? And so understanding these topics in terms of national publics and national governments remains important and core to what we're doing. On the other hand, there's something narrow about that national frame. For all that we've talked about Canada today, one might ask, well, is it somehow relevant that very similar policies were being implemented in the United States? And what was going on in the country with the largest Nikkei population outside of largest Japanese descent population outside of Japan, at the time, Brazil. And in Australia, Japanese Australians were uprooted and interned. And so how are those stories connected with one another? And how might we understand that Canadian history differently if we see it, yes, as importantly a national story, but also one that's connected with these international developments? And just as Asian and Japanese migration was not solely to Canada, but international, so too was racism an international phenomenon, and these policies themselves were international too. So now we're trying to sort of, maintain that rootedness and a concern about Canada, while also connecting. We've had wonderful engagement with partners. Audrey and I are about to go to the United States and to Brazil to connect with partners there, and we're really excited about this new work as well.
I think we've already learned a lot from our partners, and we're actually leaving tomorrow to go to Los Angeles and Sao Paulo, where we'll meet with a lot of our counterparts. But it's that sense of getting understanding across the world. It's not only about making connections among Japanese Canadians, Japanese Americans, Japanese Brazilians, etc., but it's about recognizing the different national contexts. Brazil right now is in the midst of quite a lot of civil turmoil, and questions of race, questions of indigeneity are not absent from that civil turmoil. Or a place like Hawaii, where I have spent a lot of time over the last decades, where the immigration transformed that society in so many ways, and where there are particular relations between people of Japanese descent who've been there for 6 or 7 generations and people of Pacific Islander descent who are called Indigenous people in Hawaii, where those cultures have come together and intermixed in ways that is really fascinating and exciting. So whereas our focus is upon the injustices of the 1940s in all of those contexts, are the understanding that will result from people working together, comparing, having just a sense of humanity across oceans and borders, I think is going to be really, really exciting. And of course, we've just started this second project.
Amazing. Thank you both very much for this conversation. It's been amazing to be a part of this and to be with you today, and to be able to ask you these questions. I have some questions from the audience. I have at least one. And if you are listening and you do have a question, please post it for us. I believe you posted in the Zoom chat itself. So here is my first question. It's from the audience. It says, "We tend to be proud of Canada's legal and judicial systems. What did your study discover about the integrity and ethics of Canada's courts in the 1940s and 50s?
Yeah, I guess probably some of us are more proud than others of our of our legal and judicial history. But I learned a lot in this area myself in the course of the project. So one point of comparison is often the United States, where we think, oh, in Canada we do better in terms of race relations in Canada, or that can be a kind of a concern that historians like myself have, that Canadians will think in those ways about Canada and overlook the histories of racism here. So certainly in terms of our legal and judicial processes in Canada here, the 1940s are a major instance of failure, and Japanese Canadians worked for decades, as Audrey was suggesting, to convey that failure and to change, in fact, Canadian law in this area. But in the United States, for example, in 1944, a habeas corpus claim, so kind of wrongful imprisonment claim, is successful. in the United States in in convincing the justices that American citizens can't be detained indefinitely in internment camps in the United States. Here in Canada, we have two major legal cases that I've written on with a colleague, Eric Adams, at the University of Alberta. The first on the dispossession of property that I mentioned Vivian's dad was involved in is delayed for 3 years while all of the property of Japanese Canadians is sold, basically, between 1944 and 1947. And then the judge dismisses, the judge who really should have recused himself due to conflict of interest, dismisses the case. In 1946, when Japanese Canadians are being expelled from Canada on the basis of heavily coerced signatures by which they agreed that the government could deport them to Japan, largely so they could stay where they were, and out of confusion about the moment as Canada maintained its camp system after the end of the war, and they don't know, they don't know what their futures are in Canada. That goes to the Supreme Court of Canada and then to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, and the government again is given full legal authority to expel from Canada people who on these who in these very coercive circumstances signed these forms. What is encouraging in 1946 is that there is public outcry about the failure of Canada's legal system at that time. And it's patently obvious to people that Japanese Canadians should not be expelled or not continue to be expelled on that basis. So whereas the government had organized itself to expel 10,000 Japanese Canadians, almost half of the pre-war coastal population, a remarkable number and far in excess of people being expelled in the United States, for example, 4,000 people were ultimately expelled from Canada. So the policy gets halted in the middle, not due to our courts or our legal system, which basically in conditions of war gave a sort of untrammeled authority to the federal government. And so the forms of oversight, I'm sure people on the call may have concerns about the Emergencies Act as it was implemented recently, but the forms of oversight that exist are a direct outcome of Japanese Canadian activism to point out the complete lack of oversight that existed in the 1940s.
I think what Canadians are proud of are things that have happened since the 1960s, starting with the Human Rights Act, the Bilingualism and Bicultural Commission, the changes to the Immigration Act that profoundly changed the nature of our population and our skin colors after the 1960s. And then during the 1980s, a whole swath, the repatriation of the Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the revision of the Broadcasting Act, the Multiculturalism Act, the Employment Equity Act, and I could go on, but I think those are the major ones. I'm really proud of those things, but all of those changes were happening at the time that we were negotiating redress. And of course, the end of the War Measures Act, as it was known, and it was under the War Measures Act that Japanese Canadians were dispossessed and uprooted in the 1940s. Those changes were so profound, but they didn't just come out of thin air. They came out of people fighting for their rights, fighting for recognition, whether it be because of their heritage, their religion, their gender or gender identity, all of those things. I guess I was pretty optimistic in the 1980s that everything was going to change. And not everything has changed since the 1980s. So we need to look back at how those changes occurred, how Japanese Canadians, but also other groups have experienced and influenced the government and larger society. And then we need to just keep on with the work of addressing racism as it continues to occur.
Okay, that takes me to the next question from the audience, which is, what has the project Landscapes of Injustice taught us about how to deal or lessen racism that exists in Canada and elsewhere? You guys want to take that very deep question?
I mean, yeah, I think Audrey and I would have different different answers probably. I mean, I do think landscapes of injustice is a big, like I said, a network of relationship, a kind of container of initiatives, and that were answered very differently, say, in a 5th grade classroom than in my articles or publications. I guess for me, I'll just say for me personally, I have spent a lot of time trying, and I think our project was new in the amount of investment we did in understanding the process of government itself, so the bureaucratic process. So I've tried to understand the people who stayed in those rooms generating this kind of cascade of policies that harmed Japanese Canadians in ways that they could see, and that some objected to, right? I've partly been interested in those people who weren't sort of expressing. The 1940s, you could still express very explicit and virulent race hatred, even in the corridors of government and in front of your electorate. And so, that we knew coming into the project, and that is an important part of this history as well. But I was sort of interested in folks who went on to International Court of Justice appointments, who would write angry memos to their deputy ministers saying, "What are we doing? This is racist. How can we be dispossessing people on the grounds of race? Or how can we be expelling people on the grounds of race? Or how can we be defining race in our legislation? Doesn't that make us like Nazis?"
Yeah.
And yet then they show up the next day and continue on with their jobs. And so so my interest was in seeing folks who expressed values that in fact I share, and trying to understand how they could continue to be complicit in racist acts like this. So I think for me, and I hope readers of the work that I published, and again, it's very different from the message, say, for a 5th grade classroom, and even in our museum exhibition. My learning, and that I want my readers to have, is around those ways in which we can become wrapped up or complicit in forms of injustice. And that's why I worry about this foreign agent registry again. But Audrey probably has a really different answer.
So Audrey, we're going to go to the last, I think it's the last word, because we're in our last minute and a half. So
for educators, and in my opinion, the single most important aspect of overcoming and fighting racism is education. So our research may be about specific things, but I always need to understand it in the larger context. How does racism against one group exhibit aspects of the society as a whole? That's one thing, but the other is, how do we get this message across? We write articles that are read by academics, but we also do museum exhibits. We have education programs for young kids starting with grade 5. And for me, it's really important never to lose an opportunity to put my specific research in terms of the larger context, and also to cast it forward to what's going on today, and to speak out as Jordan's doing with that article, but to speak out whenever we see something going on that indicates the extent to which racism is still among us and will just rise up as it has done in a lot of cases recently, if you just watch the news.
Both of you, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Kobayashi and Dr. Stanger-Ross. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your work. It's been really fascinating joining you to speak with you about your 7-year-long project, Landscapes of Injustice, and to hear a little bit about the future one too. And thank you to SHRC for giving us the space to have this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.